It was a rainy Thursday in Washington, D.C., the kind of gray, quiet day where headlines are born in softly lit conference halls. Inside one of those halls, the Global Summit on Faith and Governance was underway, packed with diplomats, journalists, scholars. But no one expected the comment that would ignite a worldwide storm. Former House Speaker Nancy Pelosi stepped up to the podium. Cameras clicked. Notes shuffled. With her signature confidence, she addressed the crowd. "We must not allow outdated papal ideologies," she said, "to influence modern African government, especially not under someone like Pope Leo XIV. There was a pause. Then polite chuckles. A few smirks. The comment seemed casual, maybe even forgettable to some in that room. But halfway across the world, it echoed like thunder. In a modest military base on the edge of Ouagadougou, Burkina Faso, Captain Ibrahim Traoré sat silently in front of a screen. The clip played. His face didn't move. His eyes didn't blink. Around him, advisors murmured, "It's just another Western jab," one shrugged. "Not worth a response." But Traoré wasn't shrugging. His fingers tapped slowly on the edge of the desk. Behind the calm, there was something deeper than anger. A generational weight. A pain that couldn't be laughed off. That night, he made a phone call. Short. Precise. And from that moment forward, what began as a quiet insult would ripple across borders, ignite global reflection, and awaken voices that had been silent for too long. Because sometimes, it's not the volume of a statement that shakes the world, it's the silence that follows. And this story? It was only just beginning. Captain Ibrahim Traoré didn't shout. He didn't storm out. He didn't even flinch. Instead, he sat still, like the eye of a hurricane. As the video of Pelosi's comment ended, his advisors shifted uncomfortably, throwing out strategies, deflections, and talking points. "Let it go, Captain. It's just noise." But Ibrahim Traoré was not a man who answered noise with more noise. He believed in something quieter and far more powerful. That night, as rain tapped against the window of his modest office, Traoré made a call. It wasn't to a media firm or a political strategist. It was to the National Hole would be holding a press conference in 2 days. No headlines, no press releases, just a simple line. Public briefing on agricultural reforms. And so, on that quiet morning in Ouagadougou, people filed into the hall expecting policy updates and economic figures. A few journalists adjusted their cameras, half bored, half distracted. Then, Traoré stepped onto the stage. He didn't carry a speechwriter's binder, just a single folded piece of paper. He looked out at the room, then gently set the paper down. "When Africa celebrates its faith," he began, "it's called outdated. But when the West does the same, it's called tradition." The room froze, not from offense but from recognition. He spoke not with bitterness, but with memory. "My grandmother died praying for peace while foreign warplanes passed overhead. She had no vote, no voice, just faith. And now, you call that backward?" The silence in the room deepened. Even the reporter stopped typing. Then, slowly, Traoré unfolded the paper. It was a quote from Pope Leo XIII. Not XIV, a reminder that faith, dignity, and justice know no borders. "You called him outdated," he said, "but he speaks more truth about Africa's pain than most leaders ever have." And with that, history had quietly begun to shift. At first, there was just one camera angle, one microphone, one speech in a sunlit hall in Ouagadougou. But within hours, that video swept across the internet like wildfire. It didn't trend because it was loud. It didn't go viral because of controversy. It spread because of the way Captain Ibrahim Traoré spoke, with a calm so rare, so raw, that it felt like a whisper cutting through years of noise. Millions watched the clip on loop. Some cried. Others sat in stunned silence. Hashtags began appearing across languages. Number respect Traoré. Number Africa speaks. Number silent no more. Across the globe, a college student in Baltimore uploaded a video, eyes swollen with tears. My grandfather was from Burkina Faso, she said. I never thought someone would stand up like that, without yelling, just truth. Meanwhile, deep inside Vatican walls, something unexpected was happening. A group of cardinals gathered in private had requested to watch the full speech. The room was quiet until an elderly cardinal slowly wiped his eyes and whispered, "It's been decades since someone spoke of the poor with that kind of grace." The ripple effect had begun. Back in Washington, the tone had shifted. Pelosi's team scrambled to clarify her comments. It was taken out of context, they insisted. She wasn't referring to African nations specifically. But it didn't matter. People weren't listening to her anymore. They were listening to him. Because Traoré hadn't thrown accusations. He hadn't played the political game. He simply told the truth, and in doing so, he touched a nerve that ran deeper than politics. He reminded the world that dignity doesn't shout. It stands still. And in that stillness, something powerful awakened. Not outrage but reflection. And sometimes, that's all it takes. 3 days after the speech, the world was still catching its breath. Then came the photo. It wasn't glamorous. No studio lighting. Just a wrinkled piece of paper, folded into 4, stained with time. A local journalist named Amadou Dio from a small outlet called Segal posted the image with a quiet caption. This is the letter Captain Ibrahim Traoré's mother wrote to him the night before she passed. He carries it in his uniform pocket. Always. The handwriting was shaky, barely legible, but the words spoke louder than any speech. My son, the world may never understand why we stay silent. But one day, your voice will speak for all of us. Use it with wisdom, never with hate. Speak for those who never could. The photo spread like fire across borders. Suddenly, this wasn't about geopolitics anymore. This was about something much deeper. Something human. In Ghana, a woman posted, "That's the same thing my mother told me before they bulldozed our church for a foreign project. He speaks for us all." In Brazil, in Haiti, in refugee camps and college dorms, people began sharing stories not about politics, but about pain, about faith, about the quiet strength passed down from mother to child. For the first time in a long time, Africa wasn't just being spoken about, it was speaking back, and the world was listening. Because the letter wasn't just ink on paper, it was a heartbeat. It was the echo of a million silenced voices rising through the words of one son who never forgot where he came from. And somehow, in the middle of a global storm, a single mother's words calmed the world, reminding us that even in silence, love can roar. In a quiet village near Kaya, northern Burkina Faso, the world shifted again, but not through a headline or a press release. This time, it was an 11-year-old girl named Isata. For 2 years, she hadn't said a single word. Doctors called it trauma. Her father, a church worker, had vanished during a foreign military raid. Mistaken identity. Wrong place, wrong time. Since then, Isata spent her days near a cracked old well, tracing letters in the dirt, locked inside a silence no one could break. Then one afternoon, something changed. A neighbor had pulled out an old, battery-powered television. The village gathered around it, curious. Flickering on the screen was Traoré's speech. His voice calm, steady cut through the static. Some of us were born into silence, but we will not die in it. Isata stood. Slowly. She walked toward the screen, eyes wide. And then she spoke. Just one sentence. "That's my father's voice." The village froze. Her mother collapsed in tears. Neighbors gasped. Reporters nearby caught it on film, and within hours, the clip was everywhere. People didn't just watch, they wept. One viewer wrote, "This story isn't about politics anymore. It's about healing." Because in that moment, the world saw what Traoré had really done. His words weren't weapons. They were bridges. He hadn't shouted to make noisy, had whispered to awaken the forgotten. And through that whisper, a little girl found her voice again. It wasn't just one child's miracle. It was proof. Truth spoken gently can echo louder than fury. And sometimes, all it takes is one sentence born from pain, carried by Grosseto, shake a world that has grown used to silence. Pope Leo XIV wasn't known for reacting to media stories. He rarely gave interviews, never posted on social media, and preferred handwritten letters to press statements. But something about Captain Traoré's speech wouldn't let him rest. In the silence of his private chamber, he asked for the video to be played again, and then again. He didn't speak. He just watched a soldier, from a faraway land, standing at a podium, not to attack, not to demand, but to honor the forgotten, to honor his mother, his people, his truth. Later that night, Pope Leo sat alone with a pen and a blank page. He wrote slowly, from the heart. The letter wasn't meant for the world. It was addressed privately to a young leader he'd never met. But one of his aides, moved beyond measure, shared it anonymously with a small faith-based news outlet in Italy. The letter read, "This young man, Traoré, carries the sorrow of centuries. He speaks like a prophet. He understands what many of us in power have forgotten, that dignity is not granted by empires. It is born into the soil, into the hands of every poor mother, into every child who walks barefoot with pride." When the letter surfaced, the internet lit up all over again. Catholic youth groups across Africa organized vigils. They held candles, prayed in silence. Some said, "He speaks like a priest but fights like a soldier." In that moment, lines that once divided faith, geography, language blurred. What remained was something universal, a quiet recognition of truth, spoken without ego. Meanwhile, back in Washington, Pelosi's team released a cold, two-sentence statement. "We respect diverse perspectives." But no one was looking her way anymore. All eyes were on a man with no title in the church, but a voice that had moved its highest leader. And through a single letter, written in private, the world saw something rare. When truth is spoken without anger, even power listens. Behind the scenes in Washington, things were far from quiet. Captain Traoré's calm voice had gone viral, and his words, so soft, so clear, were impossible to ignore. But for some in power, that calm wasn't comforting. It was dangerous. In a closed-door meeting late at night, a senior advisor to Pelosi leaned forward and said what everyone in the room had started to fear. "His calm is more dangerous than any protest." His words cut deeper because they carry truth. The room fell silent. No one had prepared for this kind of response, not from a soldier thousands of miles away, and certainly not with this much grace. And so, the political machinery began to turn. Leaks started to surface, whispers about Traoré's background, allegations of extremism, fabricated ties to radical groups, anonymous sources, shaky headlines. The usual strategy: discredit the message by attacking the messenger. But it didn't work, because the world had already seen something real. They'd heard his voice. They'd watched him speak with dignity. They'd seen a daughter regain her speech, a pope shed a tear, a continent begin to heal. In Burkina Faso, an old radio station aired a clip recorded years earlier. Traoré's mother, speaking softly, "If my son must carry our silence, let him also carry our strength." That broadcast reached villages, cities, churches, mosques. People listened with their hands over their hearts. Because behind the uniform, behind the headlines, they now saw something else. Not a politician, not a soldier, but a son, a brother, a human being. And in that moment, Captain Traoré became more than a name on a trending page. He became a symbol for every forgotten soul who had never been heard. A reminder that when power tries to erase truth, sometimes all it takes is a mother's voice to bring it back. In a dusty classroom in Bamako, Mali, a young teacher named Fatoumata stood in front of her students, a small laptop open on her desk. The video of Captain Traoré's speech had just finished playing. The screen went dark. No one said a word. For a moment, the only sound was the wind pressing against the thin metal window panes. Fatoumata turned to her class, trying to keep her voice steady, but her eyes shimmered with emotion. She had grown up hearing about her continent from foreign news anchors, watching maps with arrows and charts, hearing debates about aid, war, famine, always through someone else's voice, never her own. Now, for the first time, her students had heard a different kind of voice, their own. One student, no older than 10, raised his hand. "Miss, can I be like him someday?" Fatoumata smiled, holding back tears. Yes you can." Another girl whispered, "He doesn't yell like the others." But I still heard him. It wasn't a political science lesson. It was something far more powerful, a recognition, a connection to something that had always felt distant, suddenly made real. Later that day, Fatoumata uploaded a short video of her students watching the speech. She wrote, "He didn't just speak for himself. He spoke for all of us, for every child who's been taught they don't matter. When a leader speaks truth calmly, it changes hearts." The video spread quickly. Teachers from Kenya, South Africa, Nigeria, and even France responded with their own clips. A global classroom was forming, not built on power or money, but on shared dignity and hope. And it all started with one voice, carried across continents, landing softly in a room full of children who, for the first time, saw themselves in history. Because sometimes the most powerful revolutions begin in silence. It wasn't a shout. It wasn't a dramatic gesture. It was a pause. Right after Captain Ibrahim Traoré said the words, "We Africans have endured centuries of judgment, silence, and broken promises," he stopped. No movement, no breath, just stillness. The cameras in the room didn't flicker. The reporters didn't type. Even the air felt heavier. It was the kind of silence that carries generations. A silence filled not with emptiness, but with memory, with grief, and with quiet defiance. It was a moment where every unspoken story spoke. Viewers around the world watched that pause on replay, not because they missed it, but because they felt it. People who didn't even know Traoré, who didn't understand every word he said, were suddenly overcome. One viewer wrote, "I couldn't explain it, but I started crying when he stopped talking, like he was holding the pain we've never had words for." Another said, "That silence hit harder than 1,000 speeches." Because sometimes silence isn't weakness, it's strength. It's the moment when truth sits in the room and dares you to look it in the eye. Behind that pause was not a man unsure of what to say, but a man who understood the weight of his words and the power of holding them, even for just a breath. Traoré didn't have to scream to be heard. He didn't need applause to feel validated. He only needed that pause because in that quiet space, the world stopped defending, stopped debating, and started listening. It wasn't the speech that made history. It was the stillness that followed. And in that stillness, something broke open, not in anger, but in awakening. For the first time in a long time, people weren't just hearing Africa. They were feeling it. It wasn't a shout. It wasn't a dramatic gesture. It was a pause. Right after Captain Ibrahim Traoré said the words, "We Africans have endured centuries of judgment, silence, and broken promises," he stopped. No movement, no breath, just stillness. The cameras in the room didn't flicker. The reporters didn't type. Even the air felt heavier. It was the kind of silence that carries generations. A silence filled not with emptiness, but with memory, with grief, and with quiet defiance. It was a moment where every unspoken story spoke. Viewers around the world watched that pause on replay, not because they missed it, but because they felt it. People who didn't even know Traoré, who didn't understand every word he said, were suddenly overcome. One viewer wrote, "I couldn't explain it, but I started crying when he stopped talking, like he was holding the pain we've never had words for." Another said, "That silence hit harder than 1,000 speeches." Because sometimes silence isn't weakness, it's strength. It's the moment when truth sits in the room and dares you to look it in the eye. Behind that pause was not a man unsure of what to say, but a man who understood the weight of his words and the power of holding them, even for just a breath. Traoré didn't have to scream to be heard. He didn't need applause to feel validated. He only needed that pause because in that quiet space, the world stopped defending, stopped debating, and started listening. It wasn't the speech that made history. It was the stillness that followed. And in that stillness, something broke open, not in anger, but in awakening. For the first time in a long time, people weren't just hearing Africa. They were feeling it. As dawn broke over Burkina Faso, something had shifted, not in policy or politics, but in the hearts of the people. Across the country, Traoré's speech replayed on phones in crowded buses, crackling radios in open-air markets, and tiny television sets in family homes. In churches, mosques, and classrooms, his voice, measured and calm, was no longer just a leader's message. It had become a national pulse. People listened not out of duty, but out of recognition. In a small cafe in Bobo Dioulasso, a mother held her child close and whispered, "He speaks for you." On the street corners of Ouagadougou, strangers traded glances, nods of quiet solidarity. There was no celebration, no parades, just stillness and strength. A young vendor said to a reporter, "He didn't make promises, he made us feel seen." And that mattered more than any policy ever could. The hope spread beyond borders. In Dakar, in Accra, in Johannesburg, people shared the video with captions like, "This is how we rise." In Paris, African diaspora youth held a candlelight vigil, repeating his words, "We were born into silence, but we will not die in it." For the first time in years, the world wasn't talking about Africa. It was listening to it. And Traoré? He remained humble. In every interview, every off-camera moment, he reminded the world, "This isn't about me. It's about us." He walked through the capital, not as a man above the people, but among them, smiling, listening, shaking hands. Mothers cried when they saw him. Children ran to touch his sleeves. Elders raised their hands in blessing, because they weren't just seeing a president or a soldier. They were seeing themselves reflected in someone who carried their history, their pain, and now, their hope. And in a world that so often demanded noise, Ibrahim Traoré had shown the power of standing tall in silence. Back at the presidential office in Ouagadougou, Captain Ibrahim Traoré faced his team. The microphones were gone. The applause had faded. But something far more important remained: the eyes of the world. He looked at his chief of staff and said, "Words are weapons, but also shields. What I said today carries the weight of generations." The staff nodded, quietly aware that the ripple was now a wave. "You know they'll try to break you," one aide whispered. Traoré's eyes held steady. "Then let them try. Because I don't stand for myself. I stand for every voice they tried to erase." His voice didn't rise, but the room felt heavier, like truth had just entered and sat down with them. Beyond those walls, the world was still reacting. News anchors in London, Paris, and Nairobi played the speech again and again. Analysts debated his tone, his impact, his future. But on the streets and homes, in schools, in villages, something deeper was happening. In a tiny village near the capital, a girl named Aminata knelt by her window with a cracked radio in her lap. She clutched her doll and whispered, "Please, let the world listen to him." Her prayer wasn't political. It was human. She didn't want power. She just wanted her mother to smile again, to eat without fear, to dream without apology. And in that soft moment of innocence, the entire mission of Traoré became clear. This wasn't about fame or power. It was about restoring something the world had almost forgotten: dignity. His calm had become a mirror. His silence, a microphone. And in that reflection, people saw not just a soldier, but a soul carrying the dreams of millions. He didn't raise a fist. He raised a voice. And as that voice echoed across continents, it didn't end in outrage. It ended in awakening.